So let's come back and move to our next topic, which is servlet scopes and attributes. Attributes allow data to be stored and used in inter-servlet communication, and the methods associated. The scope of the data will be duration of the request, HTTP session, only available while the client is active, and servlet context, which is available across the entire life of the application. Public void set attribute is the first method available, which is used to set the given object in the application scope. We have a get attribute, which is used to return the value of the attribute. We have get init parameter names, which is used to return the names of the context initialization parameters as an enum, and remove attributes, which is used to remove the attribute with the given name from the servlet context. We now move to servlet collaboration, and we'll understand what is servlet collaboration, what are the ways of servlet collaboration, what is forwarding and redirecting, the forward and include method, and the request dispatcher interface. The servlet collaboration involves sharing of information among multiple servlets. Collaborating servlets is passing common information that is to be shared directly by one servlet to another servlet of HTML or JSP through various invocation of methods. There are various ways of servlet collaboration. We can use the request dispatcher include and forward method. We can use HTTP servlet response send direct redirect method, and we can use servlet context set attribute and get attribute methods. The request dispatcher interface is used to forward the request and response objects to another servlet. The send redirect method is used for redirecting request and response objects. The HTTP servlet response has send redirect method, which is response.send redirect, and provide the URL as to where you want the user to get redirected. The servlet request has get request dispatcher method that returns the request dispatcher object. There are two methods available, forward and include. So this is how it works. If we use the forward method, the client will send a request to servlet 1. Servlet 1 can go ahead and forward the request to the second servlet, and in parallel servlet 1 can also generate its own response. The second servlet also goes ahead and generates a specific response which is returned, and the responses are finally returned back to the browser. This is the syntax of the forward method. Request dispatcher object equal to request.getDispatcher, the URL pattern for the servlet or HTML, and then request.forward with the request and the response object. The include method, you can see here that the include method will send the request to servlet 1. Servlet 1 can generate its response, which is sent back to the client, or servlet 1 can go ahead and call another servlet 2, which can generate its own response. This response of servlet 2 is also included in the servlet 1 response. So the difference here between the forward and the include method is, in the include method you will get a consolidated response from both the servlets, which will be consolidated into a single response object and then sent back to the client. In the forward method you had two individual responses that were getting generated. This is the syntax. The request dispatcher RD equal to request.getRequestDispatcher and the URL to navigate to, and rd.include request object and response object. So here we see a simple use case of a login screen with a username and password input field and a login button. When we click on the login button, we navigate to the validate servlet, which is providing validation and checking if the username password is valid. If the username password is valid, we forward to the welcome servlet, and the welcome servlet generates a response. On the other hand, if the validate servlet fails validation and the code does not successfully clear the validation parameters for username password, We simply include the HTML file in the response and send it back. So you see here you have the current index.html file along with the specific error message that is also consolidated and returned. Let's see a small demo of the request dispatcher so we understand better the difference between the forward and the include method, and also how do we navigate users across servlets. So to summarize on what we covered, the request dispatcher is an interface that is used to chain and called one servlet from another or an HTML page from a servlet. The request dispatcher will bind the current request and response while chaining calls. No new request will be generated. The include method, as we saw, the response of the URL mentioned in the request dispatcher along with the current page's output will be shown. So the include method will include the current page along with the page mentioned in request dispatcher's configuration. The forward method, on the other hand, in this case only the URL mentioned in the request dispatcher, that outcome or that response will be shown. So it will not be a consolidated response that you will see. So let's look at this working. We will take a new dynamic web project. Let's call it dispatcher demo. Set the version to 2.5 so it generates a web config deployment descriptor file. We'll finish this. In the web content, we'll add a new HTML file and let's call it login.html. Let's add some code here that will simulate a login page. So an h2 tag that says login app version 1.0, for example. We'll add a form with action equal to login controller and method equal to post. Within this, let's say enter username. Here we'll have input, type equal to text, name equal to username, and we'll also have enter password. Just add a new line here. This will be password, type will be password, and we'll need a button to submit the form. So we're going to say input, type equal to submit, and value equal to login. So that completes our simple form. We'll now add a new package in the source folder. Call it com. We'll add a new servlet in the package, and this will be the login controller. That is what the form was posting to, action equal to login controller. We'll only select the service method here we will import javax dot servlet dot okay. So this is one way that I can use to actually go ahead and do a explicit import, and if I do not want to do that, then we follow the standard approach that we have been following so far, where we directly start with the code and it will prompt us for adding the relevant package imports, which we can do as we proceed with writing the code. So we'll come to the service method. Here we'll create string username to trap from the request object using the get parameter method. We'll pass username, which was the value we provided as the name of the input element in the form, and besides the username we'll also trap password. Then we create the request dispatcher object equal to null. We import it from javax.servlet. Then we check if the username dot equals ignore case, so that will ignore the uppercase or lowercase, and if it equals Tom, so if the user is entered Tom as the username, and the password dot equals Jerry, in that case we'll take the request dispatcher object and that will be equal to request dot get request dispatcher, and we will associate this with a servlet that we will create later on, which will be called the success servlet. Then we will forward, use the forward method and pass the request and the response. So we will actually forward to the success servlet. So this will only show us the response of the success servlet. Now in the else condition, we will again initialize the request dispatcher, but we will display the login screen again. So in case there is an error, we want to continue to hold the user on the login screen, and we'll create an object of print writer equal to response dot get writer, and let's add the package for java.io, the imports on the top. Now this time we'll call the include method, which takes the request and the response. So the outcome of the login.html plus the current page output will also be displayed simultaneously. So the login.html and the output of the processing of the else condition, where we may want to print a custom message. So let's say we want to print a custom message here that says, let's add a span as well, and we'll say style equal to color red, invalid credentials. Close the span tag and close the center tag. So what we've done here is we've created a username password to trap the username password parameter, and that's what we had provided in the login screen. So here's the username password that we are trapping. Then we create a request dispatcher object. We check if the username password equals Tom and Jerry. We navigate the user to the success servlet. So the single servlet response success servlet will be returned. On the other hand, here we create a request dispatcher object pointing to the login screen in case validation is false, and we simply call the include method, which means the response of the login HTML will be retrieved. It will just redirect us to login HTML, and we have a print statement as well that is printing some additional content. So this print statement, the output of this along with the output of this login HTML response will be grouped together, included together, and we will get the output on the same page. Now let's go to the com package. We'll create a servlet which we will name the success servlet. Again, we need, and this perfectly matches the success servlet we gave here in case login credentials were successful, and we'll just keep the service method and finish. And as part of the service method, we create the print writer object equal to response.get writer, and we'll add the package. And here we say out.print, and I give my h4 tag. We'll say welcome plus request.get parameter, and the success servlet will just display the username with a welcome message. So we'll display the username, and along with that, let's concatenate login successful at, and let's say we take in the date plus, and finally the closing tag for h4. Okay, so sysout.print h4, we are saying welcome plus request.get parameter, and we are retrieving the username. To that, we are appending a message which says login successful at, and to that we append new date. So I'll just put this onto the next line, and we'll just import java.util, which gives us the date class, and those imports automatically get added on the top using the ID. Okay, so in case the login is successful, if you look at the code that we wrote in the login controller, we were forwarding to success servlet. So success servlet just again picks up the username parameter and prints a message saying welcome user, login successful at, and the current date. We'll now go to the login.html page and attempt to execute this. We'll just have the dispatcher demo in Tomcat now. We start the server. So it says enter the username and the password. And if I try to log in, I have my invalid credentials being displayed. So, right, made a small spelling mistake there. So we'll save it and run the login page as normal. Restart the server and I get my output. I click on login. It says invalid credentials. Let's add some junk values. Continues to say invalid credentials. Let's add valid credentials. Tom as the username, Jerry as the password, and there you see it says welcome Tom, login successful, and it prints the login information. So the moment we tried to forcibly log in without correct credentials, you can see it returned the login page along with the print method that we had given. So this was the include, and you can see the URL is actually login controller. So it gave you the response from the login controller along with the response of the login.html page, which were both grouped and included together. However, when we added the correct credentials, we had the forward method that was working, and hence it just gave us the response from that specific servlet, which is the success servlet. However, please note that the URL continues to remain login controller. So the key takeaways from this session: Servlet is a Java program that can perform dynamic operations and send to a web server the result. The web server then sends this response to the web client. The web container is built on top of the Java SE platform and implements the Servlet API and the services required to process HTTP and other TCP/IP requests. The lifecycle of a servlet is controlled by the web container in which the servlet has been deployed. Servlet API contains a number of classes and interfaces that defines the contracts between a servlet class and the runtime environment provided for an instance by a confirming servlet container. Collaborating servlets is passing the common information that is to be shared directly by one servlet to another servlet of HTML or JSP through various invocations of the methods.